Well, welcome everyone to our second meeting of the Salem Zoning Subcommittee. I'm Eunice Kim, the Long Range Planning Manager for the City of Salem, and there's other staff here. Maybe I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, Lisa Anderson Overview, Planning Administrator.
Norman Wright, Community Development Director.
Austin Ross, Long Range Planner.
And I think last time I dove right in and I didn't let the city councilors and planning commissioners, if you wanted to introduce yourselves or if we wanted to do roll call.
We can introduce ourselves. There's a few
Great.
of us. I'm Chris Hoy. I'm Salem City Councilor from Ward 6 in East Salem and the Council President.
Jose Gonzalez, City Council, Ward 5, part of Northeast Salem and Central Salem.
I'm Trevor Phillips, Southeast Salem, Ward 3.
Virginia Stapleton, Northeast Salem, Ward 1.
Jane Griggs, President, Planning Commission.
I'm Ashley Schweikart, member of the Planning Commission.
Great.
Josh didn't introduce herself.
Oh, where are you, Josh? There you are.
I'm sure she's there.
Yep, sorry. Josh Pollock, Planning Commission. We don't have wards, but I do live in Ward 8.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We really see this meeting today as a continuation of the meeting, I guess, a month ago. And so we're really going to focus again on the first 3 zoning options that we started discussing last week. So we did welcome and introductions. I always start with a project overview, make sure we're all on the same page with what we're working on and where we are in the project. And again, we're going to focus again, more detailed information on those first 3 zoning options. Hopefully you all received the memo that answered some of the questions that came up. We'll go through some of those questions today and feel free to ask more questions. And public comment, though I don't think anyone signed up to comment today. And then we'll just talk about next steps. Thank you, Shelby. So feel free to, if you have questions as I go, I can see all the names to, I guess, raise your hand or just somehow signify that you have a question or you want to comment. I thought it worked well last time to kind of have a discussion as opposed to just a presentation and then. So great. So we're working on the Salem project, this project to update our comprehensive plan. We kicked it off with in 2018, I think, and the visioning phase was in the last year and a half, 2 years. The comprehensive plan is a big framework that really guides how we grow and develop long-term, next 10, 20, 30 years. And so it has goals, policies, and a map that really guide that development. It is implemented through a lot of different ways in the city. And one of the ways it's implemented is through our zoning code. And today what we're talking about is zoning code potential changes. So the focus of this zoning committee really is to look at ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, particularly as it relates to transportation. The city council, as you're aware, set a goal to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to carbon neutral by 2050. So as part of the visioning process, when we brought the Salem vision to the city council in March, as part of that process, we did incorporate that goal into the document. So it is a draft goal right now that we would carry forward into the comprehensive plan when we hope to update it. That being said, we know that it's not enough just to have a written goal. So we're trying to take steps to move closer to reaching those goals through zoning to the extent that we can. We know there's a lot of other pieces, but zoning is one of the ways that we think we can make a change. So the other component of this project is the map, the proposed comprehensive plan map, which is implemented through the zoning map. And that's all work that's going on right now, in addition to policy work and goal work. And so as part of the vision, what we did beyond just, again, putting the draft language of the goal in the vision document, but we really tried to change and add more mixed use land along our core network. So Chariot's core network, that is really the network that Chariot is committed to providing transit service and to increasing transit service when funding is available, and to have more frequent transit service. So it's kind of a reliable network that we can plan around, and we have proposed to do that with our proposed comprehensive plan map and zoning map. You'll see here that the pink is all the proposed new mixed use, or the bright pink, I should say. The pale pink is the existing mixed use. We're proposing to add roughly 1,700 acres of mixed use land, largely along the core network. In addition to that, we are proposing over 30 neighborhood hubs that again gets to kind of walkability and really connecting land use with transportation and connecting people with the places they want to go to. So that's kind of the high level map and goals that we've already kind of started working on and will continue to refine. But really the zoning options that we're going to continue to discuss today and in the future of this subcommittee are focused on, do we want to do more? And from the last meeting, I've heard the answer is yes, but do we want to do more to really promote housing and mixed use near transit and services? This is something that we're working on with the Climate Action Plan project that's ongoing as well. There are a long list of draft strategies, and there are some that are very much related to the work that we're doing with our Salem. And while this is draft language right now, I just wanted to show that there's 2 strategies related to land use and transportation. One of them is, incentivizing essentially development within a quarter mile of the core network, which is something that we can do through zoning, and we'll talk about that, and requiring majority of new housing and employment kind of in walkable mixed use areas, as well as areas served by transit. So the work we're doing here today in this subcommittee very much aligns with the work that's going on in the Climate Action Plan. So we're going to just test the polling. We have a few polling questions today. We just want to make sure that it works again. The number has changed, so it might be good to try it out. And I think the next one is the actual test. So if it's working for you, well, I guess if it's not working, you would say B, and that would actually be working for you. But we should have 8. Oh, has Ian?
And it's in the chat, so if you don't know how to get to the polling,
It didn't ask for my name. I'm doing it via text.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
And so the username is ekim310.
301.
Oh, 3, that's the reason why. See, dyslexic.
So I think we're waiting for one more. If you're having trouble, feel free to let us know.
Yeah, it's me. It's me. It's not, for some reason, it's not. I'll figure it out. Keep going. Don't wait for me. I'll figure it out.
Okay. And there's Commissioner Levin. Okay, let us know. So there's 6 zoning options that this subcommittee is going to consider and ultimately make a recommendation on. And then we as staff will take that recommendation and package it all up with all the other changes that we're proposing. And the goal is to, again, bring that all through the adoption process together. So there'll be zoning code changes, map changes, goals and policies, hopefully by the end of the year. But today we're going to kind of circle back to the first 3 that we talked about last week and kind of walk through some of those questions in the memo. And I should say, this time, I know we are going to do some interactive polling and kind of get your preferences on where to land on these, but we are providing a staff recommendation. It's just a recommendation. You're obviously welcome to make other decisions. Okay, so the first zoning option is about increasing maximum heights.
Sorry,
ahead.
Commissioner Griggs has her hand raised, and I didn't want us to get onto a different topic before.
Great.
Thank you. And I really was going to ask a question about the second one on this, because you had all 3 of the eliminate parking requirements, but I will wait for you to get to that slide now that I know you're doing it slide by slide. Thank you, Shelby.
Oh, so I should have been more clear. Yeah, we're going to walk through the first 3 again, present some information, vote, move on to the next one, kind of walk through. So as you have questions, again, feel free to raise your hand, unmute, etc. Okay, so the first one again is increasing maximum heights along our new mixed use zone. That's a proposed mixed use 3 zone along the core network. If we allow more height, we allow more opportunity to build taller buildings and more housing. It's kind of really the crux of it. And so the next slide kind of shows a summary. So last time it seems like this committee was leaning towards having a maximum height of 70 feet, but there was a lot of discussion about whether we should be pairing and really linking the height with the setback, understanding that it's all kind of works together. And there were some questions that we'll kind of walk through as well. So first question is just, we wanted to show a map that shows that the proposed mixed use 3 zone is largely located along the core network, which is the red. The mixed use 3 zone again would be a new zone that would be largely located where we have currently today commercial zones. So it would build upon mostly the commercial retail zone in terms of the uses that are allowed, but would allow housing outright. As the zone is proposed today, it would be a flexible zone. You could do retail, you could do office, you could do housing, or you could do it all together. But I just wanted to show that it's generally right now where there's already commercial zones. So we showed this slide last time that there are ways to link height and setback. It's something that we did when we first created the mixed use 1 and 2 zones as part of the State Street project. And the concern during that project that we addressed with kind of setbacks was what happens if there's a really tall building, but it's next to a single family neighborhood? You know, should the setback be a little bit further away as the building gets taller? So we structured a setback in those zones where it's adjacent to residential zones so that the taller you go, the further away you need to be from that residential zone. And unlike other zones, in these 2 mixed use 1 and 2 zones, we made it that so that the setback applies even if there's an alley. In most cases, the setback doesn't apply if there's an alley, but in these 2 zones, we made that very specific because there's a lot of homes, for example, in the State Street project, where there's an alley separating the commercial and the residential. And the same is the case, as you'll see, along a lot of other areas like on Commercial Street. So this is just to show that, you know, we don't expect people to build buildings kind of like that. I mean, they could, but really what it means is taller buildings will be pushed further away from residential homes. And so a 55-foot building, for example, would be about 70 feet away. So we've heard that it's been difficult to kind of visualize what does that look like. And we don't have a lot of new development in our mixed use 1 and 2 zones. So I just took a screenshot of our North Broadway kind of area. This is the family building blocks on Broadway. And that building is a 4-story building. And there's an alley. And then while it's not a residential zone, but there are homes on the other side of the alley. So this is just showing at the highest, that building is about 58 feet tall. And the alley is about 16 feet wide. So the setback as it's built, not as it's required, but as it's built is about 42 feet plus the alley. If this were to be a mixed use 1 or 2 zone, it would be further away than that. A 50-foot building would be over 60 feet away plus the alley. So I just wanted to be able to show kind of like this building would be further away than it's shown today if we applied that setback in the mixed use 3 zone. Does that help visualize it, hopefully? Go ahead, Commissioner Schweikart.
Yeah, it does help visualize it. And it made me think about, and I don't know if this has been already floated to the development community, but if there was any concern from the development community that like if we use the same setback requirement as the MU1 and MU2 have, where, you know, but in considering up to 70 feet in height in the MU3, would there ever be a potential to achieve the maximum height because they don't have enough depth on their parcel to accommodate both the setback and the maximum height? I mean, it seems like that we probably have, in terms of the parcels that we're actually looking at adding an MU3 and where those parcels are located in the city, that those are not going to be large pieces of land. They're not large properties. They're infill properties for the most part. And so I'm just thinking about, you know, there already may be constraints that are going to be provided by the type of lots that we'd be looking at putting MU3 on. So would we adding the setback requirement that's the 1.5 feet for each 1 foot of building height above 15 feet going to actually constrain the ability to develop those parcels if they wanted to be developed to their full height?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a question that actually some of the neighborhood associations have asked. And so we did look at the average height, average depth of some of the lots, particularly along Commercial Street. And Austin, correct me if I'm wrong, but even some of the smaller lots are at least 150 feet, I think, average. And so you could get a 70-foot tall building, but it would be pushed up pretty close to the property, the front property line. Austin, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So we did go and kind of measure what we think the kind of the average or the kind of the shortest to see if it would constrain it.
So you said, sorry, can you say, you said like 150 feet? Is that what?
I think that was on commercial.
On commercial. So a 55-foot building has a 70-foot setback. So a 70-foot building, I'm not going to be able to do the math in my head, but we're talking about more than half of the depth, maybe 2/3 the depth of the lot.
Yes.
Would have to be set back. Okay, thank you.
We would be applying this mixed-use 3 zone on some larger lots. There's quite a few larger lots as well, but yeah.
Also, it's important maybe to remember that the setback is only applied to the portion of the building at that height. So you could get a building that covers more of the lot and say on the back half, maybe it's only 50 feet, and then they do kind of a taller tower in the front. And so that part has to be further back, so that the building may not be just one height. So that's how the setback is applied to buildings today. It's just based on the section of the building at the height. It's not the overall height. So.
And in the MU1 and MU2 cases, there was also the, as I recall, we did not have setbacks to the front, to like the street side, public sidewalk, right? That's the way that we had done it.
Correct.
Thanks.
It's also worth noting that 150-foot lot depth was kind of on Commercial just south of Mission. We checked out a good sample from a lot of the different MU3 corridors, and I think overall the average is more like 250 to 300 foot lot depth. So in those cases, you would be able to utilize much more of the lot at that maximum height. It's just these smaller lots that we were looking at where it would be more constrained.
Yeah, there are concerns from SCAN on those smaller lots. Should we move on? So another question that came up last meeting, was what zones are adjacent to the proposed mixed-use 3 zone. So we did do an analysis to look at, is it mostly residential? Is it mostly about commercial? And it is actually mostly single-family residential in terms of the number of parcels. And so we wanted to show just a couple examples of the map. And you'll notice this is Commercial Street. And so the northern portion of Commercial Street, the mixed use 3 would really abut mostly single family residential. As you move south, there's more of a buffer where the mixed use 3 would be adjacent to multifamily. And then if you look out kind of on Market Street in Lancaster, it's kind of a mix, and Silverton as well, single family versus multifamily. But those are probably the 2 largest zones that are adjacent to it. The other zones that are adjacent is mostly the commercial retail zone. So are there any other questions? So we're proposing that the maximum height in the mixed use 3 be 70 feet and that we do that kind of setback based on height. Which the details are on the next slide. Those are just the details. So again, the setback would apply even if there's an alley. We do require a buffer, fence or a wall. And at 70 feet, you'd be 92.5 feet back from the property line if there is residential behind you. Any questions? We were then going to ask for input.
Looks like Commissioner Pollock has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So, remind me again, the setback for the front of the building on the street on the mixed use?
So we're not we're proposing that the buildings only be, it would be 0 to 10, similar to the mixed use 1 and 2, except unless it's residential or exclusively residential. So one of the things we heard is that there was concern about having a fully multifamily building right up against a street like Commercial or Lancaster, and that people would want a buffer. So we're actually proposing to set purely residential back 30 feet. But you could have, if you did mixed use, so if you had residential on the top floor and retail or something on the bottom, you could be pushed closer to the street. But the idea is the setback would be a little greater if it was just residential.
So you're being on a non-residential bottom floor, you're being flexible from 0 to 10. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that way, if like, for instance, it's a restaurant and they want to put tables and chairs, it's at 10-foot situation, right? Okay, thank you.
Oh, Commissioner Schweikart, sorry, I didn't see him.
Oh, no, it's okay. I just, I feel like I had like a lot of questions on this particular item. Thank you very much for providing that table that's under question number 3. I think that's really helpful. I was going to ask, based on the comments that have already been provided on the interactive map that's out there, have you seen folks have an issue with the MU3 being proposed right next to an RS owned property?
No.
Okay. Just kind of wondering if there was any pushback on that, because I feel like when it's come to Planning Commission, it's certainly been a pushback. So
we have heard concerns. We had some meetings with neighborhood chairs and land use chairs, and we've heard some from SCAN. There's concerns about height. I think their proposal is 35 feet in the mixed use zones, which is our max height for single family. So that we did hear, but generally concerned about mixed use 3 along the corridor. No.
And so when we say a setback next to residential zones, I just want to make sure that includes RS, RM1, RM2. So all 3 of those are considered the residential zones. They're setback. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Well, I think actually, Austin, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we're proposing actually a maximum setback of like more than 10 feet. I think it's up to 20 or 30 in the mixed use 3 to allow that space for landscaping or pedestrian amenities. Sorry about that.
Eunice, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Not being new to this and all that, is this kind of setback idea and the 70-foot idea, is this considered pretty conservative, or is this something that's kind of on the edge, just in general in planning?
I think it depends on the location. And so this wouldn't probably be really out there, depending, if it wasn't connected to our frequent transit network. And that's kind of why we're trying to align it. Because generally, I think cities are trying to increase densities along frequent transit. We don't have obviously like a max line or anything, but this is kind of our best transit that we have. And I think where there's going to be improvements to transit will be along these lines.
Okay, but the basics of the max height and the setback as it relates to residential, is that conservative?
Yeah, I think in the next slide or 2, I'm not sure where it is, there are setbacks. Our other setbacks are very strict, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet, 40 feet. And for example, our industrial zone, which is a pretty heavy impact, and the max height in the industrial zone, industrial general is 70 feet. The setback against residential is only 40 feet. So this is kind of going beyond what our setback would be, even in our heaviest kind of impact against residential. So in that sense, it's a pretty large setback that we would be establishing.
Yeah, that's kind of like my feelings. Like I hear you talking about this and I know that I should trust your guys' judgment. You've been doing this for a hell of a lot longer than I have. So I'm trying to lean into that, but I'm also struggling with climate change, right? And the need to really kind of become a denser city and utilize our space more. And so I see that setback and I think, dang, that's really quite far away from a residential area. And so I guess that's where I'm struggling. I'm just going to lay it out there so that other people can have more of a conversation here.
Councilor Hoy?
Thank you. And thank you, Virginia, for that comment. I think that's, I think you're right. But how I see this is that I think they've added a bunch of flexibility. So in those areas, we still have enough setback to be sensitive to those residential areas. But where that isn't an issue, then that goes away. Those setbacks minimize. And so to me, this seems like the best of both worlds, where it's flexible enough and it's almost like parcel specific enough, and it's flexible, but yet parcel specific. And so it kind of gets us to that more density, but yet not at the total expense of residents at all. So to me, it strikes a nice balance. I really, so far, I'm really liking it.
Okay, thanks, Chris. That helps me, and definitely I want to be sensitive to the single family housing situation and old neighborhoods adjusting to a new future. So I want to be sensitive to that. I also am trying to balance it all.
Yeah, definitely. And like Eunice was saying, I think this is probably our best chance to be more dense along this core network. And so I think if we can create a little bit of flexibility, so we're not, like you said, we're being sensitive to the residential neighbors. I think that's the best way to do it, but we do need to get more dense, and this gives us that opportunity.
And I think from staff's perspective, we were trying to trade off 70 feet's pretty high. These are areas right now that are generally, capped at like 50. A lot of them are commercial retail zones. And so, getting 20 more feet could be really beneficial for some projects, but then balancing it with a setback. And then on these smaller sites, maybe like the one Scan was talking about, people still have a lot of flexibility, and it's probably unlikely that someone's going to do a 50-foot tall building there. And maybe they won't be able to achieve that with the setback, but that might be okay because then they do something more in scale with those smaller lots, right? They still have the option to do, multiple story buildings and meet the setback. And so it's kind of like a choose your own path as a developer. If your thing is I do really tall buildings and it's cheaper or whatever, then that's great. You can build that, but you have to provide that setback. And if your thing is why I don't because elevator costs whatever, then you can cover more of the lot, right? You have a smaller setback, so you kind of get to make that choice, based on your site constraints and stuff. So that's kind of where we were headed with it.
And then Trevor Phillips here. My experience, or my limited experience, is that people won't necessarily complain until it's like right in front of them, and then they'll have very, very strong opinions. So this seems like a pretty good, guess as to how the community could react, and I think it'll be more well tolerated and accepted.
Does everyone want to vote? There's obviously other choices. So we're going to first ask for kind of your input on the height, and then we'll ask for your input on the setback. So the next one I think is actually the polling question.
And I'm sorry, do we do the letter or the number, the D or the?
The letter, yeah. Commissioner Pollack did the voting. Oh, it looks like there's 8 people.
Well, before you go to the setback, maybe do the 2 people that said even higher than 70 want to take a moment to try to convince the rest of the committee to why it should be higher than 70 or, to change their vote, advocate for their position?
I'm happy to give comment. This is Ian Levin, and I was apparently one of two people that just voted for greater than 70. And so listening to the conversation and considering why greater than 70, if we're talking about 50 feet now and development and what it takes to make a floor for whether it be living space or retail space, to have adequate finished ceiling height and then room for structural and then the plumbing, electrical, and mechanical. 20 feet doesn't really necessarily represent 2 floors. It could only represent one floor and then rooftop equipment that is enclosed with a decorative screen or a mansard, basically a tall forehead that sticks up above the actual roof of the building so that from the street it looks pretty. So that would be considered the finished building height. And so in that case, then, we wouldn't be looking at 20 more feet as potentially 2 floors. And so on the question about, is this out there or being bold? No, it's actually a very happy medium. And I think the 70 feet is very saleable to most neighborhoods based on kind of the parameters of how it's set back from housing and how Salem does have a lot of housing that does push up against retail a lot through town. And as we develop more and more, that some of that will get kind of blended with more transitional office that then kind of is between some of the mixed use retail and mid-rise buildings and then the neighborhoods, which is kind of the theoretical direction of development, but not always the practical case or what actually happens by choice of people moving in a community and developers building. So just kind of listening to everything, I just felt like, maybe if we're looking at certain standards that allow for height and with a correlating setback, then if a certain property were to allow, let's say, a 90-foot tall building, or I don't know, an 80-foot tall building, and then that would allow for 2 more floors of apartment units, then we'd be talking about a serious addition of actual livable space along the core network. And so then that kind of seems like, boy, if a property was the right size, then why should they be capped at 70 feet? And are we really doing ourselves any good by having that limitation there? And there, just one more comment for good of the order. At Planning Commission, there has been a lot of conversation anytime a apartment building is built near residential neighborhoods because of the height. And that's typically, apartments are 3 stories and they're in that 40-foot range. And so the potential for discussion, if this is actually put into use, will still get neighborhood pushback from people that didn't participate in our Salem and then are offended that we allowed even a 70-foot tall building, let alone maybe greater than a 70-foot tall building. But I think what really is the mitigating factor here is that there's some correlation of setback, and that would mitigate that overshadowing that a lot of people fear that comes with the big city. So thank you.
I think Commissioner Briggs, you had your hand up?
Yes, I'm not one of the 2, but I always appreciate Commissioner Levin, and I think we're very fortunate to have somebody that's actually in the field of developing, along with Commissioner Schweikart, to have their opinion. So I heard what you said, Commissioner Levin. I'm wondering, though, as a group, how much we want to piss off the public. So I would love to have the opportunity to to make some decisions today, but then can we come back and have a second chance to talk about the 6 different zones and which ones, because if they're all really aggressive and really bold, I think we're just setting ourselves up for, especially the counselors, for a lot of discussions with your constituents. So I'm in favor of the 70. I would personally go bolder, but I'm just not sure how bold we're going on the other 5. So I'd like to have a chance to revisit.
Yeah, and I should clarify that we're just talking about the maximum height in that mixed use 3 zone right now, not the 1 and the 2 in the RM multifamily zone. Councilor Hoy.
Thank you. I concur with everything that Commissioner Griggs just said. I have a follow-up on Commissioner Levin's comments, and I'm wondering, do we have a sense of how many parcels we might have that would qualify, assuming that the setback scheme was put in place? Do we have a sense of how many parcels we have around that might be eligible for something greater than 70 feet? Should we authorize that? I'm curious about that. And would there be a way to say, well, let's say we did want to get bold and we're going to go higher and maybe no limit or whatever, but yet not when it abuts a residential area, even though we have that setback kind of safety net, just kind of for like a double safety net. Okay, if it's next to a residential, if it abuts a single family residential, we wouldn't allow the maximum. We'd only allow 70, something like that. So I'm just trying to think a little bit creative that way. And then also, because I'm not a builder and I don't know anything about a lot of this stuff, can you give me, for comparison's sake, some of our brand new developments in downtown? How tall are they? Some of those kind of, square, some of the new developments, how tall are those, for instance? Like the Coase building or one of those?
I can look that one up. I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm happy to look it up.
It would be helpful for me just to get a visual of what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think last time we had a picture of the we call it always Boise, but it's not Boise. South Waterfront. And that one is
South
5.
Block.
Thank you. South, I think that's 5 stories and roughly 60 feet. Councilor Stapleton.
Yeah, I was the other one who voted for over 70, and I think that my reasoning for this is one, really wanting to be bold, and also feeling really like that compromise has been made with that setback. But I really think that what Councilor Hoy said was brilliant too. Like, how can we even make this more flexible so that it is, if it's running right up against a residential, maybe we have a little, I guess, extra protection for those areas. But then again, I struggle inside because wasn't the majority of this land, right next to residential. So for me, I'm with my other, obviously, with the above, all of the things he said as well. Extra 2 floors or whatever it is. I mean, I also think long-term, this isn't going to happen overnight. We got 30 years where this is going to be kind of the goal or the dream of what it could look like. And knowing that that's going to happen really slowly. And, it's going to happen in one area first. And we're going to hear from a lot of people about that. But then as it starts to build and happen, I think more and more people are going to become more comfortable or more familiar with what that looks like. And therefore less angry when it happens again, or maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm super idealistic right now. I haven't been in a council position where I'm going to get yelled at a ton, and I know that's going to happen. And do I want it to happen because we're trying to get to an emissions goal that maybe is worth it to me? I'm not sure. I mean, these are the things that are flying around my head. So.
Commissioner Pollack?
Yes. Well, I wanted to go back to Councilor's question about Staples, about the height, if that's the norm. 70 is not the norm for Salem, so 70 is being bold. But I just want to bring in the fact that in prior discussions with the Planning Commission And actually, in a discussion on Tuesday with the LCDC, they keep talking go big and go bold, because this is the whole idea is that we've dragged our feet so long on the dealing with the carbon emissions that we have to do something drastic. To me, 70 feet is drastic for Salem. And one of the things, if I read not only on the report that you attached here, is that it all depends on your city, what is bold and what is big. And I agree. If you start with 70, that doesn't mean you're locked in for the future. But 70 is bold. If down the line it's not bold, then we can consider a change. But Eunice, the other question, one of the questions I had, if we have this as a 70-foot max, is there a way a developer who has maybe a lot that Commissioner Levine referenced that might go up to 90 feet? Is there a way that he could come and ask for a change?
Yes.
Okay.
You can get an adjustment.
See, that's and that's the thing that I like, that there's a possibility of adjustment. So, thank you.
Thanks, President. Councilor Phillips.
So Josh asked my question, which is, basically how does someone, a developer, approach the city if they have got, a plan that's 85 feet or 90 feet that's just perfect for a lot, and they think they can make it pencil out if we do adopt the 70 foot, as a limit. I voted with the consensus so far on the 70 feet, but I'm very grateful that this conversation is a debate of 70 versus, even higher than 70. So I do think that, each community is different, and it feels like Salem, is probably has more appetite for 70 feet, and we're not going to know the pushback till later anyway. But regardless, I think it's a good discussion. I just want to know with a little more detail, like how does it work if somebody has got this great plan, they want to go to 80 feet, 90 feet, whatever, how do they get that exception? Like, and what does that process look like?
Looks like Lisa has her hand up.
I do. I raised my hand to just first answer the question about codes. 73 feet tall for the micro units downtown. So that gives you some correlation there to height. There's a zoning adjustment process. And so a lot of land use applications go through that. So if you can't meet a standard or don't want to meet a standard, you can request it. It's administrative. So it's a decision by me as the planning administrator. But first we send out notice to the neighbors, neighborhood association, and then the decision, once it's issued, can be appealed and have a hearing at the hearings officer. If somebody appeals it, we put it on the council agenda and say, hey, city council, do you want to hear the appeal, or just let it go to the hearings officer? So it's one of those two paths. Generally, if it's combined with something else, it might instead go to the planning commission, like the zoning adjustments part of their subdivision, then the appeal would go to the planning commission instead. They just have to demonstrate that what they're proposing is equally or better meets the intent of the standard. So for example, if somebody wants to reduce their setback for various reasons, they might be able to say, well, the point of the setback is light, space, open, privacy, greenery, etc. And so I'm going to put a fence, even though I'm not required to have one, but I'm going to have a smaller setback, or I'm going to put more plant units than I would normally be required so that my building can be closer. And these are the reasons I need my building closer. And so then we evaluated about like, what's the standard and then what's the intent of it? And are they still kind of meeting it? And then if they have a lot of adjustments together, the other criteria is if there's a cumulative negative impact from changing so many of the standards altogether. And so, yeah, it's a public process for them to go through that. So people get to weigh in on the specifics.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is everyone feeling comfortable with the 70? It's not locked in, right? We can always come back. Okay.
People can even still change their votes. This poll is still active if you're swayed.
And I think to the question, I think Commissioner Griggs asked, this wouldn't be your final vote. So I think our intent is at the very last meeting, we would go through all of these again, and then you could do one final. So when we could go and say the committee decided this, it will be based on that very last discussion. So again, if you feel 70 here, but then later you feel strongly about something else, and weighing those two things, you'd rather push really hard for the something else, then you could go back and change this decision at the very end. So clarify that.
Councilor Hoy.
Thank you, and thank you for that. I think I'm still in my original vote position, but I'm leaning towards the higher limit. But it would be helpful for my other, if I could at some point, certainly not right now, but have my question answered about, like, do we have a sense of how many parcels that we have that might qualify for something taller given the setback scheme that we're proposing here. But I appreciate the conversation very much. I think it's been very helpful. And I would be much more likely to be very comfortable with higher limits should we have like that double safeguard or whatever in for properties that abut a residential zone. And maybe it's just that we say, no, we leave it at the 70, but make the exception option rather than make it unlimited and, go the other way. So, you know what I mean? You have to by exception, try to go higher, but maybe that, I don't know if that's, I don't know how palatable that would be or how realistic that would be, but I think that would be a good option too, because that would certainly be a much bigger safeguard if they had to go through a full-blown public process to get higher than 70 feet.
And we can provide in the memo for the next meeting an analysis of how many of these parcels might qualify for a taller height and be able to meet the setbacks.
Quick question, Lisa. Could you also for next meeting, let me know how tall the Lee building is? That's one that's close to me. So I would love to know.
The Lee building, yeah, absolutely. I'll check.
And this was just if you wanted to vote on the setback. It sounds like there's consensus around the setback being based on height when adjacent to residential, but we did want to show you that there are other zones that just have a strict setback as well, regardless of the height.
So to clarify, number one is the proposal that was the scheme you proposed.
Can I just say that this one's a little bit hard for me to answer? I don't know. I kind of feel like others are struggling. I don't know. Because I think in my mind, I was just so focused on the setback based on height, like that stepped thing, that then now kind of having these three other options, it's just kind of messing with my head as far as like, oh, okay, wait, now what does that look like? And what would that look like next to a 70 plus building, height building next to residential, right? Like all of those questions. So I'm just having a hard time, but it looks like everybody else is fine with what you guys were talking about.
No, I think I had the same thing, Virginia, in terms of really what pushed it over the edge for me was simply the table that was provided to show us like just how many tax lots and how many acres we're talking about abutting a residential zone. Like if we had more acreage that we were considering closer to a different type of zone, I think that maybe it would make sense to change it a little bit, but that's, yeah. So it's really what this MU3 is abutting that guides my decision here.
But maybe staff could clarify, like in option B, would that be like the least amount of setback for a tall building?
Yeah, 70 feet at 15 is pretty close for a really tall building.
And then ergo, like then the next closest is C, and then D, and then A is kind of the most amount of setback.
Yes, D is definitely the biggest setback that we have.
But D is not necessarily a bigger setback than A.
Oh, right. Yes. Right. It's up to 90, I think 92.5 feet at 70 feet. The setback would be if we went with the setback based on height.
Yeah, so that's like kind of an interesting thing because we would be codifying the fact that you could put a factory much closer to folks than a retail building or mixed use building or something in this zone, because, we only require 40 feet from these heavy industrial uses to be away from housing. So in some regards, you could say, well, is that really right, that this mixed use building needs to be so much further? Is the impact really greater? I would argue no, but we also don't have a lot of manufacturing and really heavy industrial uses next to single family. So it's not necessarily something that's applied all the time. And like Commissioner Schweikert said, this zone would be next to a lot of residential zones. So
I don't know whose hand went up first.
Pollock.
It was Josh.
Great.
Okay, so the big thing on the setback was the shadow effect. And I think that especially in West Salem, that's the big issues. I remember when Northwest Human Services was building their building, the neighbors were like, oh, we're trying to get our community, we're trying to, have our gardens in the backyard, but the building shadows preventing the sun. And I think when Eunice presented to us that the setback based on height was basically the shadow of the building and what it would be blocking out. And I think that's the biggest complaint. Now, the thing is that, well, if you also build trees on there, the trees will be blocking it. Why do they not have any issues with trees? But, I could see a lot of it is not just the community gardens, but privacy. So I think setback based on height, because of the shadow effect that Eunice, I'm not exactly happy about this because I think you wasted a lot of the lot. But let me ask you this, Eunice, if they staggered it, like you said, like if the front part of the building was 70 feet and in the shadow, they build lower, maybe like a 1 or a 2, that wouldn't break the shadow. Is that okay?
Yes. So you
Okay.
can have shorter buildings closer to the property line.
See, so that the property will be utilized to the best ability to what we want in mixed use. So like if the bottom floor was retail, like for instance, your I think Commissioner Copcho always wants his bodega, his neighborhood bodega. So if the bottom floor was the bodega, but yet the front floor that was up to 70 was residential, that would be a happy medium, right? Okay, so I get it. Okay, I'm finished. Thank you.
I don't know if it was Commissioner Schweikart or Councilor Stapleton.
Schweikart.
Great.
Yeah, so I think it also kind of brings me back to Chane's comment about kind of taking all of these measures together, thinking holistically about them, because going this high, I think one of the things that we think about is then if you were to do either all residential or just one floor of commercial and then the rest of it above residential, and how many units you could possibly build, given, I guess you could probably use unit minimums and then figure out kind of the maximum number of housing units you could possibly place into one of these buildings. Then that starts to get to the second point, which is the parking component that we haven't gotten to yet. And kind of taking those together, I think, is really kind of like thinking holistically about how those two really connect to one another is something that we probably should do. In my mind, like when I think of buildings like this that have this kind of step back and have all that space in the back of their lot, they're using it for parking. Like that's what they're using it for. And so, it's an interesting thought about like, what does the land use look like if there's also no parking requirement there? And not to say that I don't think developers would want to have zero parking for the most part. I think most of them want to have some level of parking. But it's just kind of an interesting like thought of these two components together of like this, a large setback up to a potentially 70-foot building, how, you know, how many people we're housing in that building, whether they be residents or potentially if it's office space, then, you know, folks who are working there, and how we're accommodating those folks getting to and from, you know, moving around. So it feels like it's a conjoined conversation.
Chris, can I hear from you before I ask my question?
Sure. I just had two questions. One was based on something that Lisa said a few minutes ago. So these are kind of almost parcel specific questions, and they're out here mostly in Ward 6 or Ward 6 adjacent. So that odd little thing that we have on 45th, Eunice or Lisa, with the honey sticks factory, where we actually do have manufacturing out here in the residential zone, would that be impacted by any of this, or would all the new rules apply should they redevelop at some point, which I'm sure is inevitable? So that's my first question. And then the next question is regarding Center Street and the North Campus development. You know, that whole area along Center Street has not, I don't think it's been sold yet, or regardless, it certainly doesn't have a development plan yet, but that's supposed to be one of our mixed use or other kinds of areas. And I'm wondering about that, like the depth of that space, and wondering how all this would impact those, because those are kind of huge right now kind of issues out of my part of town. So I just would like to hear more about that.
Sure, absolutely. So for the honey sticks, it would apply, you know, if they were rezoned to any new development that they do. And so if they're, you know, just keep on keeping on in the buildings that they have, then they would be, you know, fine. The North
Just
Campus.
to clarify for everybody, if I can interrupt for 1 second, Lisa.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a huge parcel of land that abuts a school, but it's like this island right in the middle of a bunch of residential area that grew up around it, and kind of nobody even really knew it existed for a long time. But it's where they manufacture little honey sticks that you see at your grocery store in the checkout line. They actually are just right over here, not too far away from me, where it's actually manufacturing, but yet it's a big parcel. I don't know how big it is, but it's got a lot of potential. Yeah,
absolutely. And you can't see it from the street. So it's just, you wouldn't know it was there until you know it's there. For the North Campus, they are zoned MU1. So correct me if I'm wrong, Eunice, 65 feet, I think is the height in that zone. So that's the one we created for State Street. It was applied there as well. So they do have that setback, that step setback already, because that's in that zone. And so they have 65-foot height. I could measure the depth on those and provide that information.
It's close to 400.
Oh, there we go. Eunice is on the map. About 400. So actually that's pretty big. I think they have a lot of potential there.
Thank you. And if I could just follow up for 1 second, totally off topic, but have we considered that area for one of the hubs?
Well, I think the hubs are more small scale, right? And so this, by it's already being mixed use, it's got more development potential, and potentially could have more services that would you know, serve the area around it. So we didn't pick it for a hub. Our hope is that it will, you know, be larger than what a hub would be.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, I'll ask my question, if that's okay. So setback based on height means a 70-foot tall building is going to have 90 something tiered, stepped. Could we do like setback based on height until a certain max? Does that make sense? Lisa's nodding yes, so I am not crazy.
Yeah, no, we could. It's funny, I was thinking that earlier in part of the conversation. It could be, it's, you know, 1 foot for whatever, but no more than, and then we set what a maximum is. So if we're like, but in any case, you never have to do more than 50 or, you know,
That's
something
what I was
like that
thinking.
we could do. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was looking at this 40, the D one down here, and I was like, well, you know, what if you did setback based on height until 50 feet, and then, you know, it could proceed to whatever height it was going to go to. I don't know, just throwing it out there.
Yeah, no, that's a good suggestion.
Commissioner Levin?
Well, I really like actually that last comment about potential cap on the setback. I think that's a really genius addition. Because infinite setback could also end up pushing a building so far that just there is no lot that can go allow for that much setback. But then just so that everybody is keeping things, the reason I raised my hand was to, for good of the order, comment that so everybody's keeping this straight. This conversation about setback is related to the side of the property that would abut the residential zone, not anything that is street facing that would have set standards to it, like whether it was in the downtown where things are pushed up front, or if they're the kind of the generic 20-foot setback. That would be on like if we were talking South Commercial, that would be on the front of Commercial. We'd be talking the setback on what is, to be redundant, the backside of the property as it abuts, let's say, a residential neighborhood.
Right. Yes. Okay, so we're moving on, if everyone's okay with that. We're going to try to get through 2 more if we can. If not, that's fine. So the second option is what Commissioner Schweikart was talking about, parking, and tying together parking and all of this, and where we should eliminate parking along the core network to, again, allow more space or incentivize different types of development and support transit. So last time we spoke, there seemed to be some support for reducing requirements, but there was a lot of discussion about also using incentives as a way to reduce parking. And so, and there was a couple questions that we'll go over real quick. So generally we have proposed a 1/4 mile in terms of distance from the core network to reduce parking. We did this for multifamily because it's really considered kind of your walking distance. It's generally about 3 downtown blocks. So that's kind of why we chose the 1/4 mile. And so we did show maps, I think they're in the memo, of what that buffer looks like. I know it's really hard to see here, but we compared the 1/4 mile to the 1/8 mile, and the majority of the mixed use, sorry, Austin, I'm just going really quickly. The majority of the mixed use properties are within that 1/8 mile. But if we were to apply a elimination of parking within the mixed use zones, there would be a couple properties that we would capture if we went to the 1/4 mile. So it's not a big difference. I should say that we just did kind of a radius because we don't have the opportunity with our data to kind of do more of a as you walk distance, but that's actually how we apply it for multifamily. So there's no parking for multifamily if you're within a 1/4 mile of the core network along a street network. So it's not just as the crow flies. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Eunice, when you said no parking requirements. Correct?
Required, right. So you can provide parking, but the city wouldn't require it. So it'd be more of a market-driven decision.
Can we go back 1 slide? I'd like to study that map better. Thanks.
So you'll see this is the majority of our mixed-use zones we're really proposing them along the core network. There's a couple locations where we're trying to propose kind of new mixed-use centers out in west and south that could serve as kind of new centers for residential growth in those areas. But what we're talking about today is where do we want to further eliminate, if we do, parking along the core network. So again, along the red line, which I know is really hard to see. I think we have some close-ups.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We have some
we have some close-ups.
Show just some.
So this is the difference between the 1/4 and the 1/8 mile, thanks Lisa, of the mixed use zone. And again, the majority of our mixed use zones are within an 1/8 mile. So this is commercial, and then the next one I think is Lancaster Market. There's a few properties that would benefit if we went to a 1/4 mile. I should say, while it would benefit only, it seems like a few properties, it also wouldn't be detrimental to the area necessarily because there's not a lot of mixed use in that 1/4 mile, if that makes sense. Because the elimination of parking, we're only proposing in the mixed use zones along the core network. That makes sense?
Maybe we could explain these in maps. I know as planners, we assume people are just so
everyone
used to looking
can
at maps and instantly understanding. So if anyone's unclear on this aerial, the areas outlined in blue are the properties that would be rezoned to mixed use. The red line is the core network. So we're just showing that they're on the core network. And so between the two orange lines, that's what would be 1/8 of a mile. And then between the two yellow lines, that would pull it out to 1/4 of a mile. So we're just kind of showing, and if you want to go back one, Austin, just to show the other map again. So again, like on this, this commercial, looks like they're all within 1/8 of a mile. So there's no benefit to being within 1/4 of a mile. But I think on the slide before we showed that there's just a few properties that would be excluded, with the data, the next one. Yeah, there's just no, back one. It's okay, back one more. Right there. There's just a few properties that would be, if we picked 1/4 of a mile, we would just be excluding a few of these properties, right? The difference between 68 and 64. So is it worth picking an 1/8 of a mile, like limiting it and then just excluding a few of the properties if we end up doing this versus just saying 1/4 of a mile and including basically everything that we're rezoning to mixed use. So that's kind of what we were trying to show here.
I'm not sure. Commissioner Pollack or Councilor Hoy, who had a hand?
Pollock.
Pollack, thank you.
Josh, you're on mute.
Okay, so this is you're talking about 1/8 of a mile and the parking, correct? Right?
Yes, this is all about parking, yes.
Well, I always I remember if you recall, I had had them send out a lot of these reports, and one of the reports was an EPA funded report that the American Planning Association published. And one other thing about parking is it does speak about to like what is happening on the building. For instance, like you were saying, when we have multiple family along core network, it's 0. But they suggest that maybe you should take a look at what exactly is happening there. So if the bottom floor is retail or office space, that maybe you want to actually have a maximum of like 3 spaces for 1,000 square feet of office space or something like that. So so like we say that 0 is required of residential, are you saying 0 is required of retail and office and commercial?
Well, that's the question for the committee. So if we move on to the next slide, and to clarify, we do have maximums already. There's maximums for every use, and there's a maximum if your requirement is 0, we still apply a maximum so that people can't put too much parking. So.
Real quick, Councilor Hoy, did you have a question on them?
Thank you. Yes, actually a quick comment. Just FYI, Eunice, when the Zoom automatically puts the first hand at the top of the screen, or it repositions us, so you can always just go with the first one. That's the first hand up. So just FYI.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I was feeling very useful though.
Oh, well, comments are helpful too. But I guess the way I'm looking at this whole deal, and maybe if you could back up to one of the maps, that'd be great for context. So we're looking at trying to minimize car use and maximize transit use, obviously, but I'm trying to balance that with impact to existing neighborhoods. And so I get that it's just a few parcel difference between 1/4 mile and 1/8 mile, but really if you look at the penetration into neighborhoods, that part of that equation could potentially be much more, because we're talking about, when I say impact to the neighborhood, people parking on the street. If there's not sufficient parking at the business, so people are going to potentially be parking on the streets, impacting residential neighborhoods. So that's what that's how I'm approaching this and trying to balance it out in my head. Like where is that right balance? And I'm not there yet. I don't know. But I think that having, like we talked about before, having some of those safeguards in place for those areas, like specifically over in Virginia's ward, where you have the state offices and that are pretty heavy in pre-pandemic times, at least pretty heavy people. There's a lot of people that work in those buildings, and so there's a lot of potential for impact to those neighborhoods. Whereas out on, like for this one, for instance, The impact in the neighborhood is not so great. Well, for one thing, because East Salem is not even close to being walkable. You know, you have to cross 6, 7 lanes to, you know, you're taking your life in your own hands to cross the street sometimes. So it's not, so it's the likelihood of it being as impactful is less, but certainly down in the core is where this becomes more and more of an issue. So I think if we can go, as we go forward, figure out a way to just kind of put those, like we did with the height and the setback, you know, like have some of that individualization in here. So there's flexibility, so we can try to minimize car use, maximize transit, but yet also minimize negative impact on neighborhoods as much as possible. That's my goal. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Hoy, for standing up for Ward 1 on this issue. I know they are all gonna love you for that. But then I go back and like I'm there because, you know, I'm right across the street from state buildings and we have to, you know, buy our little, it's not, what is it, like $15 a year or something ridiculous for a sticker for our car so we can park here. But, and of course there are times that the mail truck is parked in my spot as if I own, you know, that sticker, you know, gives me the right to my spot on my street. Anyway, and you have to park down the block and walk back to your house or whatnot. But then I go back to the conversations that I think I've had with you, Eunice Kim, about the parking studies that we've done in the Grant neighborhood, and how they really haven't shown what people have perceived to be the issue or the strain. And so I have to kind of balance my want to protect, sorry, I'm talking slow, I want to choose my words well. I have to balance my want or need to protect what has always been and balance with the reality of the data and the reality of where we need to go, right? And so when I think about it having a negative impact and it becomes more difficult for me to drive the, you know, half a mile to my hairdressers and fight for a parking spot, or whether I just say, screw that, I'm gonna leave the car and I'm gonna walk the half mile to my hairdressers instead of driving and parking. Like, where is that balance? And maybe we have a conversation about the balance between making something more painful potentially, but then getting to the outcome that we want, that is more public transportation, more active transportation, less driving, less parking. I don't know, can we talk about that with this? My rambliness, sorry.
No, that's the whole discussion. Yeah, I think that's the whole discussion. And not to jump too far ahead, but I should say that what we're recommending as staff is that we would eliminate parking for mixed use within a quarter mile of the core. So we're trying to incentivize mixed use development and also create the opportunity where there's a lot of this land is commercial use. So if you say you don't have to do parking, again, you can provide it if you want to, but you don't have to do parking. If you have a commercial existing business and you want to add housing, it then frees up some space to actually add that housing where there's currently parking. So kind of infill. And then we're recommending, and I know this is jumping way ahead, then just adding more options for uses generally to reduce their parking through incentives. So adding to kind of our list of how you can reduce your parking otherwise. But again, that's jumping ahead. Councilor Gonzalez.
Hey, thanks everybody. Everybody's comments so far, and great work on this from the staff. You know, I just wanted to add something about the traffic in the neighborhoods. And I agree. I mean, it's just certain times, and we're still a growing city. So I don't know if we'll ever get to that point where there'll be no parking. But one of the things that I don't know if those studies take into account, because I haven't heard this yet, regardless of climate action, all that stuff, is, you know, a couple years ago, well, maybe about 10 now, it was on Mother's Day. So we went to Bush Park, and of course it was busy and packed. So we had to park on High Street, and High Street was jam packed. Well, as we were getting out of our car and I was getting some stuff, my it must have been 3, 4, 5-year-old daughter jumps out, right? And because of the way the cars were parked, you know where I'm going. Because of the way the cars were parked, even at a relatively slow speed, a car hit my daughter. You know, so it's She's fine. She's in high school today, but we got to remember how people move around, and filling up these spots, you just have to be careful, because it's going to be on those days when we say, well, it's just a few days out of the year. Well, those are the days that I almost lost my daughter, just because of limited parking and us trying to enjoy the park as a big family. It was a lot of us coming together, trying to bring our barbecue and all these little things that we couldn't do on a bus or on a bike. So I just wanted to share that, because that was something that happened here in Salem.
Appreciate you sharing that. Councillor Stapleton.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. And I'm sorry that happened, your daughter. That's scary. And pedestrian deaths in the city of Salem are continuing to rise. And that's, I think, another issue that we as council have to look at and face. I also was wondering if we could go back to the difference between the quarter mile and the eighth of a mile on the core network. And what I was kind of studying was Ward 1, and because I really wanted to see what that looked like. And the difference between the two was kind of funny, because here on the quarter mile, I think it's pretty much all of downtown and Grant, some of Nen, up into Highland, right? And Edgewater. But then if you just kind of watch Grant neighborhood, which I think is the only neighborhood that is completely covered by the quarter mile. I think other neighborhood areas are kind of half and half or broken up. But the difference, it kind of gives you this weird little leg in, and then an island in the middle of downtown. And so my question, when I focus in on Grant neighborhood, or can do, is that, I guess, worth it? There's this little tiny sliver that's not in. Am I making sense? I keep saying, am I making sense? But sorry, that's my personality.
Yeah, I think Ward 1 is uniquely impacted because of how many major streets go through it. And then the buses are coming from downtown, right, and going to other places on these major streets that go through, Grant. And it's worth just remembering we would only be talking about properties that are zoned MU 1, 2, or 3. But obviously you can see on this map north of downtown, the purple, right? The purple is there in Grant, north of Candu. So, Grant has, as you mentioned, with your parking pass, and all neighborhoods have this ability, but block by block, to get a residential parking district created. And then the fees are pretty low for the residents to get the passes, and then it limits, parking during certain hours, which could be a way for an impacted neighborhood to deal with it. In some ways, it just cascades it to the next block who hasn't set up that district, and then to the next and to the next. And that's, I think we mentioned last time, that parking management plan that we did for North Downtown, and that was one of the things that it kind of showed, that the blocks that had gone through that program almost had no cars all day long on their street, because people went to work and then nobody could park there. But then further, state workers were willing for free parking to walk further and further and further north. And so some of that's how the state manages their parking and different things. But yeah, some of these problems I think could just really be solved by a more cohesive parking management system in the city. City of Eugene, they have somebody whose whole job is to manage parking in the city, and that's on-street residential parking. It's paid parking downtown. It's their parking garages, and they, take their money from these different paid parking and they use it for public art and beautification and all these different things. And it's also the person who takes all the complaints. And here at the city, it's spread all around to different people. The city traffic engineer, whose job and background is about safety of an intersection, also has to take the complaints about on-street parking and people parking on my street that don't belong here. And, and then through a land use application, we might get all the complaints that aren't really related to the development. And then downtown is handled by UD and different folks. So I've always thought that's a big hole in the way the city operates, is that we don't have a cohesive kind of look at our parking, whether it's on-site, on the street, et cetera. And so I think trying to eliminate parking really brings that to the fore, that we if we're going to eliminate on-site parking, then we really need to get a better handle on what we're doing with our on-street parking, including how a lot of our major streets don't have on-street parking, right? And so that's a struggle that we've been dealing with when we look at putting new mixed use. If you want a walkable area, you really think of somewhere like Broadway where you can park on the street and the building's up close and you get out and you go in, and then we're looking at streets like, oh, Market or South Commercial, and there's no on-street parking, right? And so some of that also is our street design. All those things aren't currently aligning to get where we want to go with these walkable neighborhoods. So maybe that's me rambling, but I'm just thinking of all these kind of thoughts together. I don't know if there's more hands raised, but Eunice, did we have a slide next with our recommendation? Oh, there are more hands raised, sorry. Let's see.
Councilor Phillips?
Oh, Phillips.
I think Ian was first.
Commissioner Levin?
Thank you. Oh gosh, where were my thoughts? Sorry, I'm driving into Silverton and the cell phone signal is hit or miss, and I was just having a panic attack because I thought you were going to call on me right when I was losing consistent signal, and then I had lost my train of thought. So the parking requirement, I think it's important to be careful about language, and because we're not eliminating parking, we're eliminating the requirement, the basic requirement for parking, so that as final language of this is implemented and neighborhood associations read it, they don't read the wrong message. And the idea of market deciding the value and the usefulness of a building with parking versus a building without parking is one of the most fair and appropriate ways to address it. And knowing that we have some climate change factors that are driving decisions about how we develop property way more intensely than we did 10, 20, and 30 years ago. I guess the idea that, well, the market will decide, and we'll see that with those micro apartments in downtown and how well they rent. And the opposite of that is that if they don't, we have a derelict building in downtown because it doesn't rent. In fact, we'll probably have a building that somebody or the city will get to buy and use for their temporary housing if those apartments don't rent. But that is, when people talk about letting the market decide, that is also what we're talking about. And that means that somebody might try building a mixed use property and reducing the parking. I can think of a couple of developers that just should not even be allowed to do it because maybe I don't approve of their ethical decisions. But to be candid, there's people that would take advantage of that to try to maximize the amount of rentable square foot they could make, not to look at it as how can I improve walkability and connectivity of neighborhoods. And so it's I think it's a delicate balance as we enter into this conversation of eliminating requirements for parking or reducing parking requirements. And there's always going to be nuances that will come about that will factor into how we weigh through this. But even as a real estate professional, I struggle with the idea of completely eliminating the requirement for parking. So that was one train of thought that I wanted to share. There's been some conversation, like we talked about, it was just the idea of parking on the street on South Commercial. We're not trying to make all of Salem walkable. So let's also stay focused on what areas are we trying to make walkable based on the growth of the city. And if we focus on those areas and it becomes more popular, then it might expand. But I think, saying, well, we don't have on-street parking on South Commercial, and nobody's going to be doing that anyways, because it's South Commercial and it's a 5-lane road, and there's existing huge parking lots. And as it goes to the market drivers, if something doesn't work, it's still going to sit there for years and years and years until somebody values it enough for something else that they go change it and maybe tear down part of a building and build parking. And then my last train of thought, since it was brought up, and I appreciate the opportunity to raise this to a completely new subcommittee or commission, but because there's a couple of city councilors a part of this, I've been pretty outspoken about development standards in the city of Salem and the use of roundabouts as traffic and pedestrian interchanges. And there's been consistent pushback, which is totally fine. But I would take this opportunity to urge the city councilors that are part of this subcommittee to do some homework on the difference of roundabouts, what it costs the city to operate long-term, and the safety impact on pedestrian connectivity and the lethal points of impact with vehicle reduction in lethal intersections with traffic. It's phenomenal how much safer they are for everybody in the community, and reduce carbon emissions. So I really, because this is related to our Salem, and that's the underlying development document for the city going forward, there's lots of developments that they put in a 4-way intersection because that's in the development standards. And we need to have some maybe incentives or some obligations to start using roundabouts instead.
Thanks, Ian. Austin, do you want to go to the staff recommendation slide real quick, just so we can?
Just a quick comment for Ian, if I could interrupt, I apologize for bursting ahead in the line. We did just authorize a roundabout the other night at City Council out on 27th.
That is outstanding. I'm so excited to hear that.
Yeah, so ground has been broken. I mean, we're actually forging ahead up by the new Costco. So yeah, there is going to be around, at least that may be the first one in the city. I don't know.
Councilor Stapleton.
Do you mind, Trevor? I think you were up first.
Go ahead, Virginia.
Okay. Yeah, what I wanted to say is just really quick, because I know time is of the essence. I love the roundabout thing. That's fantastic. Also, could we require, if they were not going to do parking and they were within a quarter mile of, or have reduced parking, whatever, could we have them have requirements to increase or make improvements to the bike and ped infrastructure within that quarter mile?
I mean, we can definitely, and I think that's one of the things we allow. We can have them do on site. For example, we could have them do more bike parking, or give them the option more bike parking, covered bike parking. On the Broadway area, we have options. They can reduce parking if they do like a plaza for pedestrians, or work with transit and put in a covered bus stop, etc. I don't know if there's a big enough. I don't know if there's a nexus, like what Dan was talking about yesterday, nexus for land use of that training, to have them do like an offsite improvement to a bike ped facility necessarily, but I think they can do on-site stuff to beef up pedestrian or bicycling to that site.
Yeah, I would be really interested in that. Like the one that we just had over here on D Street with Dev Northwest. They're at like a really interesting intersection where there's a pedestrian, but there's no marking, and it's, cars are kind of turning at weird angles. And so if we could have had, them put in a crosswalk there, or something like that to help with the increase of cars in the area, to help increase the pedestrian safety in that area, kind of right where they're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, is that on the next slide, Austin, where we talk about some things that other cities do? And we have a slide where
those were in the memo as well. Our idea was to our recommendation was again to reduce parking for mixed use within a quarter mile, but also just to pursue other ways to reduce parking. And so we provided some of the examples from Portland, but we would look at other examples as well. So other uses could reduce their parking, but then they would give, right, maybe more bike parking, car share spaces, etc. So that was our thought.
Yeah. Councilor Phillips, who has been skipped numerous times. So
all right. My question is vague. It deserved to be skipped. But broadly speaking, there were really good questions that came before me. I made the right choice. I'm a huge fan of roundabouts. I'm glad we're getting one. I agree they're safer and they have benefits for the environment. So as much as we can impact that with this subcommittee, I'm on board wholeheartedly. From that, my initial question is a bit scattered, but I get the sense that we're trying to achieve like reduction of greenhouse gases through zoning, and doing that with this increased flexibility or withdrawing a requirement on parking has probably got some impact, but I'm not sure if the impact is as much as we think it is. And again, I would just like to get more data on that specifically. And then because like we're kind of in a chicken or the egg situation right now, where if we get rid of the parking, but we don't have the infrastructure for biking or walking, we could potentially be creating islands that are really difficult to get people to and from. So I have some concerns for the practicality. I mean, Councilor Gonzalez brought up that safety issue. And I know that my wife, trying to get our kids across town, and we really, the data is the data, like, the climate disruption is real. We all lived through the forest fires. I mean, we want to make an impact. That's why we're all here. But at the same time, like, I don't want to do it in a way that we shoot ourselves in the foot and create islands that are unsafe. So I haven't even phrased a question yet. First off, if a developer wanted more parking, is there a reason why the elimination of the requirement would make it more difficult for them to get parking? And two, how can we avoid creating islands that don't have sufficient pedestrian and bicycle or active transit connections? We do have more mixed use that's a little further away from the core network, specifically in Ward 3. So I have some concerns, selfishly, because there's some stuff with I'm going to get it wrong, but it's Fairview. There's like a green neighborhood that's got a lot of mixed use in it. So we have the potential for some islands over there.
Yeah, so I think your first question is no, they could still do parking if they want to. And then there's just like on any use a maximum. So if they came in and said, how much parking do I need? We say, well, you don't need any. And they say, okay, well, I still think I need 30, then there's a calculation in the code. We would, if it's an office, we would say, well, generally office needs this, and you can have this much extra. And so that's what we would apply as your max. So we would still cap them at the max. I think one of the ways, maybe Eunice wants to jump in, that we could do it is that maybe we only reduce the parking in like an MU1 zone versus like the MU3. So in the first part of today's meeting, we were only looking at MU3, this new zone we're creating. And that's, although it's a mixed use zone, it's being applied to places that are probably less walkable, more because they've been developed as commercial retail areas over time. But we do have areas where we already either have MU1 or proposing MU1, which is a more urban walkable zone. Although it allows outright housing, retail and office, just like MU3, it has design standards that really are pushing the buildings to look very urban. And so the intent is really walkable, urban form. And so some of the places where we put that are on streets that are not huge, huge, wide, 8 lanes to cross kind of thing. So potentially that's a way we could do it. We could target this parking reduction to those areas. I guess the other thing, and it's been hard for some people in the community to, I guess, trust that it's going to happen or want to wait for it, is that after our Salem is adopted, the next step would be to update the transportation system plan and have an implementation strategy for how we're actually going to achieve some of these things. So a lot of the impetus behind the mixed use and located on the core network is also that the transportation network needs to be improved. And so one is like, we need to change our plans to make it clear that our whatever street design that we're implementing is going to support that walkable mixed use. And then also for the council to decide that the money that they spend through CIP projects, et cetera, is also going to support that. And so it's going to be multi-year kind of follow through. And so some of that is like more to come, I guess, is what I would say to that. But potentially just reducing the parking in certain areas that are already more walkable and targeted is something that we could go back and look at and bring some sort of recommendation forward. Did I mess anything up, Eunice, or is that you agree with that?
No, I would just say that the mixed use 1 and 2 zones, we did already reduce the parking for retail because we were trying to incentivize retail in those zones specifically because the zones are again very flexible. So we could even scale it back and say we could specifically just do it for a use that we're really trying to incentivize. We picked mixed use because that's kind of what the ideal is. We really would like that mixed use on sites, but we could scale it back.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember these MU3 sites. If somebody had say they already have an office building or something and they come in and say, well, I want to put apartments behind it. The apartments by itself already don't have a parking requirement, right, in the core network. So it's the apartments themselves wouldn't need any parking. And so what we're saying is, do we want to further incentivize them putting housing by saying you can build over your parking that you have for your office, for example, to build those apartments? Instead of, well, you just have to maintain all your parking for your office. And if you can squeeze some housing in behind it, good for you. But if you can't, too bad, because we really want that parking for your office to remain. And so we're thinking, well, no, we really want the housing along those cores. And we really want just more mixed use and more housing near services. And so it might be okay to give up some of that parking that might be there for an office or retail use, because then they can use that land to put housing. So that's why our recommendation would be currently is only if they're adding housing and it becomes a true mixed use site, would it be okay then to not have the parking? And that's, that's the reasoning behind our recommendation. So I guess we'll just, just jump to the poll with all that. With all that, I guess based on a recommendation, just, first vote.
Not binding.
Not binding. A would be, yes, we think if somebody adds housing to their site, they could get rid of the parking for the non-housing use as well. If you think that makes sense, then that would be A. If you think, heck no, all the uses should just be left to the market, they don't have to have parking, that would be B.
So just to clarify, A is a little more restrictive than B.
A is you actually have to have a mix of uses. So a lot of those sites are commercial, you would have to add housing. B is whatever you want to build within those mixed use areas that are near core. So say you just want to do office, you just want to do restaurant, you don't need parking as a requirement. Along what Commissioner Levin was saying, you could provide it, but we wouldn't require it. So it opens it up to all uses, not a mix of uses together on the same site.
Yeah, so A is really pushing for the housing. It's really an incentive to get more housing there.
Oh, not to interrupt this poll, but I heard, I think it was Lisa was talking about Eugene and how they have, like a person who coordinates parking. I mean, does that overlap with the purview of this subcommittee, or is that kind of a different topic? That was very interesting what you discussed earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a different topic, and I don't know, Eunice, if the climate action plan is going to recommend kind of more on the parking front and parking management in the city.
What I thought I heard was, I thought Lisa suggesting we should implement paid parking downtown. Is that what you said? Because that's what I heard. I don't know.
Is that going to be the headline? Oh no. I mean, I will say as a professional planner that I think there should be paid parking downtown on the street, and for lots of various reasons. I know there's other considerations, but as a professional planner, I think all the professional planners at the city would say the same thing, that there should be paid parking.
And in all seriousness, Trevor, probably that's the conversation at some point ultimately where we could tie into what Lisa was suggesting in terms of having a more robust and comprehensive parking strategy, is if somehow there were some sort of revenue associated with it, i.e. more paid parking.
Thank you.
And I do think there are going to be recommendations related to parking coming out of climate action. Councilor Stapleton.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly ask that if, you know, we talked about people with their codes coming and asking for changes or, you know, adjustments. Can people also come to council or come to planning and ask for changes in their parking requirements? That's a yes. Okay, great.
So we have about 15 minutes left. I don't want to rush the conversation, but I am going to move on. So this is about minimum densities in our mixed use and multifamily zones. Again, core network versus citywide. I think I provided some of the research that we had done in the memo. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate some of that real quickly. And again, if we don't get to voting, that's okay. This is a map to show again, most of it's along our core network. So it seemed again like there was support, but a lot of questions last time, whether or not it was feasible to still do development if we increased our minimum densities, and then kind of what density bonuses are there currently or possibilities. So we did do some more research, talk to developers about kind of what are they developing at, not just the data, which we did look at, kind of what recent development has been developing at, but also just asking, would 15 units per acre, which is where we think the state's going to land, achievable, or will it create kind of a barrier? And pretty much everyone said not a barrier, particularly along the core network where, again, parking already as a requirement has been eliminated. And we, I think it was just last year, made it very flexible in terms of doing our design standards for multifamily. And so we think there's enough flexibility in there, you know, again, to not create a barrier if we were to increase the density. So today our minimum densities are 12 units per acre in the multifamily 2 and the mixed use zones. So it would be just a little bump up to 15. We did get questions from a developer about, you know, would this work on a very small site, so an infill site? So I did look again at our permit data, and even like a 3, 5, 7, or maybe it was a 10 unit, they are developing at least 15 units per acre. So it doesn't look like it would be a barrier for even smaller developments on small sites. We showed this last time as a comparison. Other cities do have higher minimum densities than we do. But we don't have density bonuses. We've done our incentives through reductions to parking, having heights, etc. But we don't have a traditional density bonus where we say, if you're located in this area, you get an additional floor. If you do affordable housing, you get an additional floor. But there is a Senate Bill 8 that's likely going to pass that would require us to actually have a density bonus for affordable housing only. So obviously we would implement that if that passed. It does look like it's going to pass. Councilor Hoy?
If there's a possibility to go beyond that in terms of affordable housing, I am all for it. I think we need to do absolutely as much as possible to help incentivize and to help make affordable housing more doable for developers. I think that if it's going to happen, it's going to take our assistance. And I think whatever we can do to really maximize that and really go bold when it comes to affordable housing is somewhere I would like to see, certainly for a lot of reasons, not just greenhouse gases, but for a lot of reasons.
Agreed. I mean, would it be possible to also maybe fast track the application process if they do affordable housing or other bonuses?
We do have an expedited kind of process right now. I think it's 100 days. That was a state law that was passed a couple years ago. So that is something that's in place already.
But could we even go bolder, go faster? I don't know. I'm just
what Councilor Hoy said.
Faster than 100 days, Lisa?
I mean, it's always faster than 100 days if they meet all the standards, right?
Yeah.
That's for any development because it doesn't go out for notice generally. I think what I hear you saying though is through the zoning, can we maybe eliminate requirements if it's income restricted? So that's something we can look at. And then there will be some information coming to the council about more financial incentives for middle housing. It's required under the state law that the council take a look at whatever kind of financial incentives are available under state law. So that will be coming to the council, I believe, in a work session coming up this summer. so that kind of more comprehensive information will be presented during that work session.
Commissioner Schweikart.
I think Josh was first.
Commissioner Pollack. It's because I have two rows, guys. Okay.
It's okay.
A couple of things. When you said go bolder about affordable housing, actually, I keep referring to that EPA report on from that was published by associate planners. And one of the things they say is go bolder is that to actually dedicate in the planning unit somebody that just specifically only deals with affordable housing, and not only to help expedite things, but to be very knowledgeable and showing and to providing options, including like if they certain percentages, credits, if they don't want to do affordable housing, cash in lieu of affordable housing, that would help go to a fund where the city could help subsidize affordable housing and things such as that. So it's that when you say go bolder, that's another way to go bolder on affordable housing, but that's not what we're talking here about. We're talking about the density issue. That when I'm looking at also at a report on there on the density issue, it does talk about whether it's on a rapid bus line or a core bus line. It's just like the regular bus lines. The report that I'm talking about shows regular bus lines were like 7 units, but on a core network 12, but on a rapid 15. So I think 15 is a really good, bold and aggressive unit number. So I think that what staff recommendation is really great, because it's basically considering that transit's going to do its thing and be there, like reduce its time to get people from one place to another. And so 15 units, I think it'd be great. That's it for me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so as someone who develops affordable housing, but in a different state, I can kind of talk about a little bit about how it's done. I work in the Central Coast of California and building affordable housing, and the state of California has a law that everyone refers to it as the density bonus law, but it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that, in that it provides you with a menu of options that if you're building a certain percentage of affordable housing in your development, that you can ask for up to 3, they call them like variances or exceptions, and that can be from a menu. So it could be that you're asking for a parking reduction, a height increase, and a setback reduction or something like that. So it's actually like it's a menu that's presented if you are building a certain percentage of affordable housing. And so, because it's not necessarily always that you need to go denser, it's just that you're trying to figure out how to make a project that is typically it's going to require a lot of flexibility in order to create. And so that's something that the state of California utilizes, is that kind of like menu of options. And a lot of city and county governments do add on top of that. And so almost all the jurisdictions that I work in have their own add-ons. So either like their own local city or county density bonus or parking reduction for affordable housing. And a lot of them actually do it based on like the level of affordability. So the deeper you go, the more incentives you're provided. So that way you are incentivizing a range of affordable options. So you have things, as low as like 30% of area median income, and then the 50s, the 60s, the 80s. But kind of how that proportion plays out allows you a certain level of flexibility. So that's something to think about here. The other thing I was going to say with respect to Commissioner Pollack's point is that, there's a lot of communities out there across the country that say, in specific zones or specific areas of our city, we are going to mandate that either you create a certain percentage of affordable housing if you're building residential, or you pay, a fee. And so, thinking about how that kind of would apply here, if we are going to say we have this new MU3 zone and we have it, basically along the core network, then, what are the possibilities of potentially incentivizing affordable housing, either incentivizing the housing being built or incentivizing through the developer paying, an impact fee, if you will, that goes into a city fund for the explicit purpose of affordable housing development. So that's something that is a tool that other communities use, is to say, if you're going to build residential in this particular part of town, in this space that's a transit-oriented development area, then you have to build 10-15% to affordable housing or pay us a fee. So it's a possibility.
And we can look at some incentives. I'm not sure under the inclusionary zoning law if the fee in lieu is a option, and I know Portland already has established it. I can take a look, but I think that's maybe part of the conversation that's going to be happening with the House Bill 2001 incentives of affordable housing. Commissioner Griggs, but we should also look at California. That's a great idea.
Yeah, and I was just gonna commend Commissioner Swikart's comments about that. I think the easiest thing that we can sell to the public in all this work that we're doing is the fact that we need more affordable housing. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. So I really have no problem with the 15 units density. I love the idea of the menu of positive options that they can take, and I would go that route rather than the penalizing route. But Commissioner Schweikart, those are great ideas. And not just because you're on Planning Commission.
So not to rush everyone again, but do you feel like you want to vote on this one? It's the last one that we have. Yeah, thumbs up. Okay. Austin, do you want to advance? So we were going to say 15 within the core network where we're doing a lot of these incentives for housing. We've talked about height, we've talked about parking, or do we want to look across the city? Our recommendation is within the core network. So B is broader, it's everywhere. A is core network.
So, and just to make sure everyone understands density, it just means if you're going to build housing, then there's a certain amount you have to build. And we do the density calculation. That's how it applies today. Multifamily, someone has a multifamily zone, they can't just come in and say, I'm just going to build a duplex. If it's a really big lot, we do the calculation and say, well, actually the minimum density is maybe 6 units per, on this size lot. And so then they have to meet that to get their building permits.
And the predicted state requirement, would it be most in line with A or B, or?
Yeah, what we're hearing is it would probably be along transit.
A.
Oh, I'm sorry, A. Sorry. I will say when I talk to developers, they are always trying to maximize, is what they've told me.
Sounds like based on these votes.
So maybe everywhere.
Everywhere. So again, in the RM2, what is it today? Units, it's 12. So it would be going up 3 units per acre across the city. So
and we would push up the range. So the other thing developer said is if you're going to push up the minimum, push up the maximum by the same amount. So you're not scrunching people. So we would do that.
I should have also just briefly mentioned that in terms of federal funding sources for affordable housing that come through either HUD or the IRS when it comes to low-income housing tax credits, those when they talk about having amenity points to score for to be awarded those funding sources, that those funding sources applications go up to half a mile. In order to receive the potential like amenity points of proximity to transportation and other amenities. So that's, it's kind of an interesting twist there is that affordable housing actually has a little bit more of a broader ability in terms of where they build. They can build a little bit farther out from transportation than a quarter mile and still be eligible, competitive for those funding sources.
Thanks. So much knowledge here in this virtual room. So we don't have anyone talking from the public, which is good time-wise, but so we're going to come back on June 9th and just high level the last three. Our goal is that we kind of understand your, then leaning and questions that you have. So then we can come back and discuss again in more detail on June 21st, walk through the last three options, kind of like we did today. So it's going to be very high level on the 9th. It's like a week and a half away. And then we're thinking about adding one more meeting so that we can kind of talk about all these together and just make sure there aren't, changes or, everything works together. So look for an email from me to try to set that. It will probably be obviously in July. So I know vacation schedules are tough. So I'll try to throw out a bunch of options. And I think that's it. Oh, yeah. That is it. Unless there's other comments. We made it 2:00.
I was just going to say too that there were some questions that were asked, so we took notes and we'll put those in the memo for the next meeting with the answers to those questions.
Well, then thank you so much. It was a really great conversation. I really appreciate all the questions. And then we'll see you really soon, June 9th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.